Hey everyone, welcome to another edition of Real Estate News Unpacked. I'm your co-host, Marcel, your money guy, all things real estate financing, alongside Ronald Ducuto, and he is your 5-star Michelin specialist designer. This is your go-to guy for all things design. Ronald, how was the week? What do we have to unpack? It's a big week.
Oh man, it's just been an incredible week. All headlines coming in from provincial government, federal government, municipal government. They have certainly really shown that they are truly looking to protect Ontario, protect Canada, and move housing forward. So on a provincial level, I saw some bills like Bill C5. That bill is actually really going to support infrastructure. I see on the provincial side, we see Bill 5, Bill 17 coming through. I mean, amazing stuff. I mean, obviously, there's going to be pushback from various groups, but this is also going to spur on a lot of economic growth potentially. And then on the municipal level, biggest city right here in Ontario, Toronto, had an amazing meeting at council yesterday. And at that meeting, we saw there's some great news come true.
So it looks like, Ronald, you were front and center, the teacher's pet, courtside, might I say, for this Planning and Housing Committee meeting, June 12th. This was the big one for the Sixplex, which we're going to go dive deep into. Ronald, what was the atmosphere like? What was the vibe in person?
Well, my friend, I felt like I was sitting front row at the Raptors game, 2019, right?
Courtside, Ronald for three.
Oh yeah, swish, swish. Hey, I gotta say this. In fact, it
Doing.
was actually super cool, to be quite honest, to be sitting front row and center and basically looking at what it is the conversations were happening. So on one side of the arena, you had in the blue, you had your YIMBYs. On the left side, you had red, like that's your NIMBYs, and they were basically going at it through the chair, as they would say in council. And really, it was just really interesting to hear the banter back and forth. And I think ultimately it was a positive outcome, and we're looking to see that process progress through the actual council.
Right on. So NIMBY, not in your backyard. YIMBY, yes, in my backyard. So pro. So one is against and one is for develop protagonist yin and yang. Um, Excellent. So as we mentioned, Ronald, you were there in person for this housing committee meeting. These meetings take place, just for some context, they take place on a monthly basis, and this is where they sort out all things housing related to reports and initiatives. And then the next step will be to go to committee in this case for the Sixplex. So lots of interesting stuff that was said here. Maybe let's just go back and provide a little bit of context of where all of this is coming from. So just to provide some context of where all this is coming from and why this was so important and why we were there. Well, Ronald was there in person. I was listening in on the airwaves. All of this stems from a report that was delivered May 28th, 2025 from planning. And really, this is to support the need. This was a study that was done to look at to really evaluate, low-rise multiplexes up to 6 dwellings with a height of up to 4 stories in detached residential buildings within neighborhoods. So this is a gentle density kind of uplift. And this is all in context for a city that's growing rapidly. We've got a mid-rise and high-rise focus that's now been, how do we say, slowed down or crashed. And now we're kind of looking at that was primarily focused in the downtown and the avenues. Now we're looking at, okay, how do we grow past that? What happens to these gentle density neighborhoods, which are essentially 70% in the yellow belt, all single family and detached? What happens to these homes and housing in these neighborhoods as we go forward? Okay, so the underlying influence for all of this really is being driven by the Housing Accelerator Fund. Ron, take us through. What is the Housing Accelerator Fund? Why does it matter? Why is it important?
So the Housing Accelerator Fund is a $4 billion fund that was set up by the Trudeau government back in 2023. And that fund was essentially set up so to incentivize municipalities to actually increase density so that they can actually meet some housing targets. As you know, there's some robust housing targets that are set up by federal government, which is then downloaded to the provincial government, and of course the municipalities have to basically figure out how to do that. Well, the federal government set up this HAF fund, Housing Accelerator Fund, to essentially aid with the development of those. So that fund really is designed to promote various upzoning activities within the districts that actually submit housing action plans.
Right. So we've got cities that are kind of 2 feet in, like Toronto, producing, excellent, research reports like this. And we've got cities like Oakville. We talked about that in our last podcast, that are kind of 1 foot in, 1 foot out, kind of giving money back now because they don't really want to go through with more development, right?
Oh yeah, 100%. And some cities are going to be like that because again, even though there is a plan to actually move housing forward from all levels of government, there will always be, certain actors that are just simply not aligned with that, and they have a voice as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So everyone's got autonomy here. Let's jump into some of the concerns around this research report. So these are concerns that are coming from this report, um, not necessarily what happened on June 12th yesterday. So a few things here, Ron. I just want to point out that we can kind of unpack. So we've got, these are kind of pro and for gentle density, and kind of against concerns. One of the things that is in support of is this, this type of activity really helps with mortgage payments. We call it a mortgage helper in many instances. And what that means is if you purchase a home with this type of additional income, that income can be used to help you qualify for that home. So now you're not just relying on your income or maybe your spouse's income. You actually have rental income that will help you qualify and thereby get into a neighborhood that you may not have otherwise been qualified to get into. So that's a big one there. That's a my story is all about that, right? Like I bought the fourplex, lived in one unit, and rented out the rest. That was literally a game changer for me. I lived rent free, allowed me to go and buy more properties. So I totally get that, and I think that's a massive benefit. Now the usual stuff: overlook of neighbor properties, so like privacy concerns. We hear this on every development. Property maintenance, like there's going to be all these people. Is it going to look like a dump in front of the property, right? Forestry, removing illegal trees. Like what's like why are some of these things important, or maybe not? Like what's going on here? What's the rhetoric? What do you think's going on here, Ron?
Oh yeah, absolutely. There's so many red tape. I mean, you hear it in all these various provincial bills that are coming out. Let's cut red tape, cut red tape, cut red tape. There's so many different processes and documentation and forms to fill out and people to speak with and parties that need to get involved on a simple garden suite install, right? And
Right.
I say simple, but I also know that there is complexity there. But one of the things that I personally notice is that even when there is sort of a means of kind of circumventing some of these steps, you realize that it sometimes add complexity. So I would try to advise my clients, look, let's not try to circumvent anything, right? Let's not try to do any dance. Let's just simply go through all the processes. So in this case here, where they're talking about urban forestry, increased fines, yeah, there are increased fines. In fact, we worked with a client who actually had to get an arborist prepare a tree protection plan because their neighbor's tree was in close proximity to the property line, right? So again, that's a certain red flag. I certainly get it. Should a tree prohibit a unit from being installed and providing housing? Well, that's a question that is still up in the air, right?
Okay, let's look at some of the other concerns, Ron, that we've got continuing on with this report. Once again, I got to tip my hat, to the city of Toronto and all of those that were involved in this. I know rehousing was involved in this as well. A really well done job with this report, really detailed, and just got everything out of what's going on with regards to this issue. Continue on with these concerns, increased density in the context of flooding. So we hear about this, lots of basement floodings in certain areas. This could be location specific. Parking, the infamous parking. Where are you going to park? In a world where we will soon have driverless cars, or will we? Let's find out. Parking always remains one of those top issues. Garbage bin collecting, like where are you going to put the garbage bins in relation to the sidewalk? This one's interesting. We've talked about this in some of our past episodes. Young people do not want to live in cramped quarters, but want single family homes with yards and privacy. Talk to me about this, Ron. What is going on here?
I think this is more of a tale that supports the need for multiplex housing typology within this urban setting, right? Because the fact that, this supports absolutely. In fact, I personally know, like I live out in the suburbs. I know you live in the urban center, but I live out in the suburbs.
Big city.
And I'll say, look, before I had a family, I was so ready to move out into the suburbs because I know I eventually would start a family. And I thought it just to be advantageous, right? I thought it to be advantageous to basically have the ability to utilize a backyard for various type of activities and so forth. And having that freedom even just to go outdoors and work without having, to be within that type of, enclosed quarters per se. So I see the benefit here for sure. And I think more people are going to want to live in these multiplex type properties where they have access to some green space within the confines or boundary of the property, right?
Right. Yeah. I'm mixed with this one, right? Because I think the city of Toronto is closer to the city of New York and the city of London in terms of its context, its population, the way we're growing, and these cities are very urban, and part of the attraction to these cities is, you can walk to things, right? So you can, where you live, you can walk to restaurants, you can walk to entertainment, you can walk to the subway. You don't necessarily need a car. There's a vibe in the neighborhood. And, I think these multiplexes will only enhance that, right? With intensifying these neighborhoods. So, yeah, that's an interesting one. I'm not too sure. Depending on what hat you wear, it can swing either way. Property value concerns and property tax. So, based on your massive valuation, are you paying your fair share in property tax?
Oh, you will. You will.
I think you will. I don't think this is going to be. I don't think that's really.
This is not a question.
A question. Yeah. Developers will not actually pass any savings from reduced development charges to home buyers. Not exactly entirely sure what that means, because if you're the developer, you're building these rentals. Where's the home buyer coming in? Like, these are not condos. So
this is actually quite an interesting one, and one that we kind of touched on briefly on a previous recording. And
yes, that was the fourplex in Yonge and Lawrence, and they were strata titling the fourplex and selling each unit at $2 million.
That's right, and had like 90 objections. But
90 objections.
One of the things that we were kind of talking about there, well, let's say fast forward whenever these development charge bylaws come into play and development charges are removed from, let's say, building a fourplex or a 10plex, for example. Like, what is going to keep, or who's going to monitor the savings that is actually being passed on to the developer through the reduced or removed development charges, and ensure that that's actually being passed on to reduce the price of the actual home, right? That's being rented or being sold, right? So
Okay, so
yeah.
so one case we're talking about the tenants that are going to rent from you,
Yeah, absolutely.
right? So some affordability there. So you're getting some savings from DCs. On
Well,
the
I
other
mean,
side,
some
you're
savings might be an understatement, because it's like $100,000+ in the city of Toronto for
sure.
DCs,
Yeah.
right?
Okay. So, but it's all relative to the cost to build,
Exactly.
right?
Yes.
It's a small piece of what it costs to build some of these things. Um, and then on the other end, you're saying the home buyer. So that would be the case in the case where the title may be strata, and that gets passed on. I'm of mixed opinion. I think the okay, first of all, in order to make these feasible, you need that DC help. You need that DC kind of waiver in order to make them. Otherwise, no one will build them. So that's full stop, right? Like it just doesn't pencil. So that helps create them. I don't necessarily think that needs to be passed on in all cases to the end buyer or the tenants necessarily. Um, I think you may. I think there's going to be better incentives coming from CMHC to see more affordability in these. And I think if you get like we've run the numbers every which way from Sunday, right? So, once you get 5, 6, you're starting to get into to a territory where at least one of those units can now be affordable, right? In that main building, and I think that's where your win is going to be from an affordability standpoint, and the savings kind of passed on, so to speak.
Well, I would say I partly agree with that. And I say, look at any product. Let's just use bread, right? I like raisin bread, right? It's nice. But let's look at that supply chain: flour, maybe some raisins in there, a little bit of gas to like cook that bread up, get a nice bun, right? Now, with that said, if every sort of supplier along that supply chain can reduce their overhead in some way, reduce the cost of the product, the flour, and so forth, shouldn't that be passed on to the person ultimately purchasing this loaf of bread at the store? And I feel like, obviously we know that that's not the case, because
That's not the case. That'll never be the case because whoever has the product makes the rules, right? So
exactly, which is
that's
unfair, by the way, when it comes to housing. I'd say absolute it's unfair in all cases, but it's particularly unfair when, one the developer is saying, look, we need reduce DCs so we can build more. But then when you get to build more at a reduced DC, right, cost, you simply don't actually turn that
yeah.
over. So you don't turn that
Look at
over to the end product, right?
look at the cost of building and the pass through will never be done entirely from a builder or a developer or an end user home, whoever, like we always paint the developer and the builder as the bad guy, but look at people that renovate their homes. Are they passing savings on to the buyer? No one's passing savings on. So I think that needs to be done by um, third party stakeholders in the transaction, and that's primarily going to come from financing, like CMHC and the type of financing you might get, um, and maybe some pressure from the city, right, in terms of planning and maybe what you can get a little bit more height or whatnot. But let's move on from that. The last piece, kind of like right in line with what we're just discussing: CMHC funding, affordability, and affordable units. We've kind of touched on this in that last discussion, but my whole premise or my whole thesis is: look at 4 units or less, there is no financing for that. If you spend the type of money that most people spend to convert or value add or even build new, 4 or less, the numbers do not pencil, right? You're going to have a ton of equity. I've got clients with tons of equity trapped in these 3 and 4plexes, right? Because you can't pencil. The way you finance that is based on a debt service ratio, right? And it's just Like values have far outpaced income. So and rents for that matter, right? So it just doesn't work. You need, so either you bring your financing product down to 4 or less, or you allow 4 or more, in this case 5 and in this case 5 and 6 unit buildings to be done, and that's your takeout, right? That's your magic solution for getting the small developer to come and do this project, right? Like,
No, this is really good conversation. I honestly think when I look at the clients that I work with, obviously 2 units used to be a thing back in 2020, maybe 2019. Is no longer even a viable product, even in this market. Even though there has been a reduced, as you know, in housing prices, right? Even though we're currently in a buyer's market, still property values are still up there. It's still high enough that people essentially they're tying up a lot of their cash within these properties, right? And then when you're renovating these, obviously they cost a lot. A lot of people don't think about the cost associated, the hard cost, the soft cost. So with that said, I absolutely agree with you. Like this is something that would need to be looked at, and how is that going to be looked at? Who is going to address this potential concern? Who do you think is addressing this concern? Is it the purchaser? Is it the government? Is it the developer?
well, this is a policy concern. CMHC is looking at this already. They've got the MLI program, and that's where the MLI program kind of fits in. But it's 5 plus, right? And 5 has always been that magic number in financing for residential department versus commercial department, right? That's always kind of existed. It's just 5 is a very odd number. There aren't many, buildings, small scale buildings that are 5 units. So no, I think this is all good stuff, but it'll get sorted out. I think the whole like affordability and the different levels with the MLI program will sort that out, and I think it's definitely something to keep an eye on, right? Because that financing, the takeout is of utmost importance, because most of these cannot be sold at the valuation that they're appraising at. That just won't happen, right? So if builders do not have that takeout, these projects won't get done. It's just plain and simple. Moving on, this is we're gonna move on to the whole Sixplex PH 22.4 aspect of the meeting that happened June 12th. This is the Planning and Housing Committee meeting that happened yesterday, City of Toronto. Ron, take us through this report.
Absolutely. So expanding permissions in neighborhoods. What does that stand for? And we'll continue to speak about this because if you haven't heard this before, you need to know. There is an acronym. It's actually called EHON, EHON, expanding housing options in neighborhoods. If you haven't heard about that, Google it. But essentially, this is the City of Toronto plan to or initiative that they have launched to basically provide more housing options, and this is a phased approach, so there's many items within this initiatives. For example, there's laneway homes, there is garden suites, there is multiplexes, and now there is sixplexes, 5 and up to sixplexes. And this is something that I think a lot of people are very, very concerned with right now. But look, this is Toronto. I know we were chatting earlier on. This is a big city. This is a major city, major metropolis. And I think we really need to look at how it is we can actually provide proper housing.
So EHON is a really important initiative. Why don't we provide the link below for that, for folks to check that out further?
Okay, great. So I would say that, let's move on to what it is we're actually looking at here when it comes to this particular initiative. So one of the things that this initiative contained was the actual move from a multiplex to a sixplex. But the first we're just looking at what was actually done, right? So you can see here multiplex building permits in neighborhoods. And this map will also provide a link to this map. And this was part of the presentation done by the City of Toronto at City Hall on June the 12th during their council meeting or their committee meeting. That's Planning and Housing Committee. And you can see here there are some little dots. This is full of a lot of information, but essentially this is very simplified to just show all of the building permits that were essentially reviewed already. It doesn't mean that it was built, but permits that were reviewed. And Marcel, if you can take a look here, you can see like most of it is concentrated within a very small portion.
Yeah, that looks like to be the west corridor of the city, kind of south of Eglinton, east of about Jane, west of Young, north of the Queensway. So that kind of what I call the coolest areas or the coolest neighborhoods in the city. You know, you've got Roncy, Junction, High Park, areas like this, Davenport. Very kind of cool, hip neighborhoods. Lots of old stock, mature tree line, um, busy, bustling kind of vibe in that part of the city.
Yeah, absolutely. And I raise a question like, obviously there's most of the multiplexes are being installed within that pocket, like for obvious reasons, because people within that pocket want to live that lifestyle, right? They want to live
Yeah.
that lifestyle. And I also think too, I mean, what would you say about prices? I don't know how much you would know about prices within that area, but you have any comments on that? Like, would that area make a project more financially feasible to turn to a multiplex or?
Well, what does make okay, so first of all, the way you buy is obviously going to be important, right? And right now, if you're doing the 4+1s, you kind of want to be in that million or less, maybe 1.1 price range, or less. I think you can do better. Most people, if you buy a derelict bungalow, right? I always tell people you buy the worst property on the best street, right? Um, but really, what it comes down to with that neighborhood and that part of the city is the rents. The rents are very high. So that's why a lot of developers, small developers, like that area of the city. It's there's a premium for rents. You're gonna hit, high threes, $4 a square foot rent in this neighborhood, and that'll help to make your end project pencil out. Um, Actually, I recently went and did a tour of a developer's project in that neighborhood, and yeah, he did a it was on an avenue and did a fiveplex, so 5 units plus a ground level mixed use or retail space. And yeah, he was hitting $4 rents there, $3,900 for a two bedroom. $3,900 for a two bedroom. Yeah. So yeah, you're gonna hit the rents in that neighborhood versus like Ron, you made a point, like even if you look at like kind of Scarborough and north of the city on that same map, there's not much activity going on out there. And you're thinking like, why? The properties are much cheaper, the lot sizes are much larger, but you're not gonna get the high rent just because the city has not, those areas of the city are not connected to the core, right? As well as they could be with transportation. So I think that's something that's a key detail for the city that they need to think about as the city gets more connected to the core. Kind of Union Station or downtown being the center of the universe. Um, then those that'll start to unlock some of those other neighborhoods because I've looked at projects out there. I've seen projects cross my desk and like great properties out there, properties that you can buy and maybe even sever into two or three
Yeah.
for these multiplex projects that exist, right? So
Well, here's my thesis on this, right? Like I think the situation you just explained actually certainly aligns with what it is a lot of NIMBYs would suggest. Is that why put multiplexes outside of the core when there is transit that is required or already available in the core, the infrastructure and so forth is set up to accommodate that type of multiplexes. I mean, of course, some will beg to differ because those lots are smaller, to your point, in sort of the outskirts or suburban type regions, you'll find larger lots that would be allowed for severances and so forth. Now, what does I tend to think though is that, and we were kind of chatting about this earlier on, right? About this negative loop, right? The negative loop of basically, you don't have the transit in place because you don't have the ratepayers or the constituents that's actually able to fund that type of infrastructure, right? But having more like ratepayers, more a denser population, you'd be able to fund more of that type of infrastructure that's needed to see a city grow in that way. And of course, just like most cities, like you have been to many major cities, as you mentioned, is like, the city kind of starts in the core and grows out. But some cities actually grow out in a very sustainable way. And, the only how that can happen is that you can't just have one center. You have to have other centers as well, other population group. And of course, that does also lead into the question of, well, you can't just have residents living in a place. There has to be employment and so forth. So I think the city of Toronto is doing a great job kind of master planning and really putting a lot of policies in place to promote that type of density. And I believe if we can see a shift from just focusing on existing, because the existing constituents don't want multiplexes, but the people that want multiplexes, they don't yet live in those neighborhoods.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's kind of the negative loop, right?
That's the loop, right? Those that live there already own and don't want anyone there, right? Those that don't live there want to live there, want to get in, but there aren't enough places to live, so therefore the stuff that does exist is very high rent. But yeah, let's continue on.
No, absolutely. And this is really interesting conversation, by the way, because I truly believe that we have an opportunity here to make a real positive change in the city of Toronto. And Toronto actually is really leading the way throughout Ontario. And we talked about the Housing Accelerator Fund and what that is. But what we did not talk about, Marcel, was the actual fact that Toronto actually committed with some initiatives. They said, like, we are committed to launching some initiatives, to be exact, I think 8 initiatives within their action plan that they submitted to solicit the funds from this Housing Accelerator Fund. And I actually think to what they have access to is $471 million. And they have already been paid out some of that because that's based on if you're hitting their housing targets, right? So Toronto is actually doing well. But within those housing initiatives, there is this idea that Toronto, and I'll just read from here the underlined words, Toronto, including permissions for 4-story multi-unit residential development, including multiplexes, and its potential to contribute to Toronto's housing supply, and the permissions for residential buildings with up to 6 dwelling units. This is what it is they said they will do, and they submitted this to the federal government. Now, I don't know the answer to this question, but I'll just put it out there. If they do not get 6 units approved in the city of Toronto, does that mean they have to return the funds for not actually accomplishing the goal?
Yeah, I mean, I would imagine that's what Oakville had to do, but maybe Ron, a better question is what's next? So we had this June 12th meeting. And I've seen people on the internet say, "Oh yeah, everything's approved, it's ready to go," and it's kind of like, whoa, hold your horses. So, like, what are the next steps in getting this approved? The sentiment definitely wasn't all roses. Yeah, green light. Yeah, like they're the counselors were really hammering this. In particular, Counselor Holiday, right? So like what are the next steps here?
Yeah, very intelligent Counselor Holiday there for sure. Really raised some great points, some great, I don't want to say objections, but really tried to pull out as much as he could from the deputants, right? And I personally think that it's great to have that type of conversation happening. Now, what it is, I think a lot of people are missing, to your point, this was there are some levels within the government, and while I'm not a politician, I've kind of looked at enough of this stuff, and what I know from a level standpoint is that we just witnessed a vote that was carried from a committee. There are multiple committees that carry votes every time they have meetings. That does not mean approval. It just means that it was carried, and yes, it will be considered by council, by all the ward councillors, right? When they meet in the executive meeting, which is chaired by the mayor, right? This particular planning and committee meeting is chaired by a councillor, right? So with that said, what has to happen next is carried, right? It was voted, the motion was carried. So now they have said, okay, good, we accept it, and they're going to make some amendments. Now they're going to take that to council. Council is now going to vote on that. All councillors in all their wards, they're all going to now put a vote in and say, okay, well, we support this or not, or we want to see some changes or not, or we simply just going to shoot this thing down and like, this is just not happening in Toronto.
Right.
Again, as mentioned, the Housing Accelerator Fund application that noted those initiatives was actually voted in council. So all of these councillors, they know exactly what needs to be done.
Right. Right.
So
So there's a lot of motivation to make this happen, but from what I understand, there's some resistance. There's a lot of resistance, right? And this is interesting. So, anyways, let's carry on.
Yeah, so what this we are seeing here is like, look, they also talked about the monitoring program, and I think it's really important to note this, and we will link all these slides. Is actually City of Toronto. This was not, I didn't create this, so, we just simply clipped a few things out that we thought were really important. And here, these were some of the things that they think that could be improved, right? It could be improved, or it may be comments that they think need to be addressed in order to move multiplexes forward. And this is the whole idea. I'm just going to read this: cap or number of bedrooms. So, Marcel, I don't know if you know anyone that has an 8-bedroom multi-unit.
Yeah, it makes no sense. Like when I saw this, I'm thinking, man, I couldn't even fit 8 bedrooms if I wanted to in one unit. And furthermore, this is handled in the permitting process.
Absolutely,
right?
Absolutely.
So
this is handled in the permitting
process. It's a non-starter.
Process. So this whole cap here is really important to note here that, look, they're talking about multi-tenant housing. They don't want these multiplexes to turn into multi-tenant housing. But this is handled from a zoning standpoint and a building code standpoint. So there are specific zones that that allows for multi-tenant housing, and it's clearly shown on the maps that are provided by the city. And then there's also very specific requirements within the building code that also allows for this type of sizing of these bedrooms. So, I'm not going to get into the details of it, but
we don't need to, but
regulated, right?
Just for clarity, multi-tenant housing, otherwise known as rooming houses, correct? Right.
Well, I mean, they really want to remove the stigma, so it's called multi-tenant housing. But yes, that's right, exactly. For layman's term, people say rooming housing, but these things are extremely regulated right now. There's a bylaw for multi-tenant housing that really improves the safety and operation of them.
Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, look, we certainly see a lot of this in our line of work, and I can tell you, we cannot just simply drop a multi-tenant housing in the middle of Scarborough. Like, that's just not possible because the regulations don't allow for it. And the city does a meticulous job at reviewing these building permit applications. So first they do a zoning review, and then they do a building permit review. And if you don't get past those stages, it won't even get approved where inspections can happen and construction. So this is, as you said, a non-starter, right? But one of the things that I want to just also note here is that what it is we are seeing is that there's a shift in definition. Right? There's a shift in definition. So we all know this as some people say multifamily, some people say multi-unit, but it's actually defined within the zoning bylaw as a multiplex. A multiplex is a building that has at least, 2 units, 3 units, 4 units, or oftentimes called a duplex, a triplex, or a fourplex, right? And that is, which is the case. Now, what we are seeing proposed in the new provisions for in the amendment for the zoning bylaws is that we're seeing they're shifting from saying a multiplex to calling it a houseplex. And we are toying around with words. That's what most of the NIMBYs would say, but it's a very, very important distinction that is being made here, right? And I think what we'll see is that actually removes a lot of restrictions in some of the other things that is being monitored, and we'll talk on. So, I can see here as well as we move on down to pre-existing sites and area-specific restrictive exceptions. Like, this is another big one. These monitoring items, like, the city does a great job. They know where it is they have made missteps, and they're really trying to clear that up so that we don't create problems, right? You don't create problems, but also more than not creating problems, they create clarity. And in really looking to address these pre-existing, like, site-specific restrictive exemptions, like, for example, in some places within the yellow belt, you may, if you go to the zoning map, you may click on it and you'll see an X, like 3,052. Like, I mean, that's how many, like, this is an exorbitant amount of exemptions because they're site specific, and who knows how it got there, but essentially it may restrict the height of a building, the side yard setback of a building, very specific to that site that's outside of the zoning bylaw.
Right. So this is not we're not talking here exemptions for utilities and right of ways and things of that nature.
Well, it could be anything. It could be anything. It could be those things, but it's oftentimes not. It's kind of more basic stuff. Like maybe some neighbor at 15 years ago decided that they didn't want a setback to be X amount as per the bylaw, and that exemption got written into the bylaw. Now, I don't know all the proceedings behind it, but there's so many site specific. So it's two adjacent sites can have two very separate exceptions, right? Which is obviously not good for streamlining any type of process.
Right. So moving on, what's this semi-detached multiplex issue? What's the issue there?
This has been a real sort of challenge, like, since multiplex became a thing. So I really getting into the details of this will sound more confusing than not. So I'll just really simply say this: there is what would be called a 2-pin semi, and also there's what would be called a 1-pin semi. And a pin, when I say pin, I'm talking about property identification number. I think sometimes it's called property identification or ID, right? So with that said, some semis may actually be severed down the party wall that divides the both units, and they're two separate pins, two separate properties. Whereas in some municipalities, not Toronto, I haven't seen one of those, but in some properties you may see a semi, but that semi actually is on one pin.
One pin. Okay.
It's on one pin.
Okay, so what's this zoning issue around that? Like, why does this matter? Why is this important?
So this is really important because once you have a property that has, and this goes all the way to the multiplex stuff, but once you have a property that has one pin that contains 5 or more units, it's no longer considered a multiplex. It's considered an apartment building, which has significantly more requirements. There's a lot of other things that need to be accounted.
We're now talking Part 3 building code and all that.
Well, we're talking Part 3 building code, but I think more so we're talking zoning requirements that becomes really restrictive, right? And again, not going to get into details. This is not a master class on zoning. This is just simply to give a high level understanding of what these changes and why they matter, right? And so this is really important. This change, where it is they are potentially going to be including or looking at this issue of semi-detached multiplexes. This would now allow you to put 4, 5, and if approved, 6 units within a multiplex without triggering an apartment building type requirement, right? So again, this is advantageous. Now, I want to really point out here, this is very specific here. This is saying the word new, right? So this is also, will this actually be very specific to new only, and then they're going to grandfather in all existing semis to have the existing provisions. So again, we don't know all the answers until the bylaw actually gets finalized.
Right. So from my perspective, and I'm just trying to get to the meat and the potatoes of this. From my perspective, if I'm buying an existing semi, or if I'm buying an existing property where there's a semi, so one pin on the lot, but it's wide enough to create two semis, that's where this new definition would come in. So I could potentially buy that and create two semis. Or no, maybe the example is more, I'm buying a detached, which is one pin, but I would want to turn it's wide enough to maybe do two, right? And I'd want to do those two as semis. So two semis.
I think that's why this is very specific to say new, because that's where the opportunity lies. This is not necessarily only for economic consideration here, right? This is where the opportunity lies to create more housing. If you can take a single detached home, sever it, which by the way, the requirements for a semi in terms of lot frontage or lot width is less than a detached home width, right? So if you can add two semi-detached homes which can house multiple families, you're creating much more housing, much more homes on the same footprint. Like, I mean, that's what gentle densification really, that's the epitome of it. That's in the essence of it, right? So that's what I think this is really leaning towards here. But again, we will have to see the bylaws, and they have a drafted bylaws, so we can even put a link to that as well, right, Marcel, inside the description so people can access that.
Okay, so let's talk about these development charges that do not apply when a laneway or garden suite is what is it, less than 5 units, right?
Yeah, less than five. So that's what we're seeing. We're seeing that there's a workaround when someone is doing a fourplex plus one, meaning a garden suite. We call it a Plex plus. What you're seeing is that people are doing these plexes, and they're simply applying for building permits. Once that's applied for, because the DCs are waived on that, they're then going back and actually doing a garden suite, which is also exempted under a different part of the DC bylaw, but it has to be done separately, almost like a separate permit. So that's the only time it would be considered.
So that's now delaying the project, reducing efficiency, but you get away from, alternatively, if you did it together, you would now pay DCs on that additional unit and the others, or just the additional unit?
So no, you'd pay DCs on the additional unit. So anything right now above 4 is waived. However, a garden suite is allowed on any residential parcel of land, which has special provisions to be waived. Again, all of this is actually looked at very separately by the finance department within the city, right? So they have their processes that they're reviewing and the bylaws that they're reviewing. So with that said, what is actually being proposed here is that they're saying, well, is there a way that development charges do not apply to these things, like across the board? Like, just forget about it. Like, let's not even make this a part of the conversation. Just streamline this whole process.
Yeah, that's definitely something that needs to be highly considered. So, okay, Sixplex study.
Yeah, Sixplex study, my friend. Like,
that's why we're here.
This is big, man. So permit Sixplexes in all zones across the city of Toronto. That's straightforward. You can't mistake that. You can see the yellow belt right below there. That yellow, all those yellows. So, you know, in fact, let me just take a step back here and say, like, look at this. Look at this map here, right? Like, this is the map. This is the yellow belt. It's called a yellow belt because it's all residential. Well, all of this is essentially where it is they want to allow sixplexes. If you look to the far right of the map, that's Scarborough North. Well, I should say, sorry, to the far right almost, Ward 23, you know, right where McCowan is and so forth. You can see right there is where it is they're allowing this pilot program. So Councillor Jamal Myers actually put his hand up. He's actually really pro-housing and supporting this program of sixplexes within the city of Toronto. And with that said, what we have seen that has happened is that they're now promoting the bylaws and so forth to really move this across on Toronto. And as we noted before, the Housing Accelerator Fund actually requires it because it was actually submitted as part of the solution, so part of the initiatives that they're going to be doing. Right? Now, 6 units permitted in new or converted detached. I mean, that goes without saying. This can happen. In fact, we do more retrofits than we do new builds, which is also a very environmentally, it's not only gentle density, right? But it's also environmentally friendly because not a lot of demolition, not a lot of carbon input into these renovations.
Yeah,
And so
it's also less risky. I always advise like newbies and those are just getting started, do the value add, take the existing, add an addition, chop it up in some way versus building new, right? So um I like that. That's a good one. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And then if you look here, there's one more here, maximize height. Like, look, this is the only change from a multiplex. We talked about this many times before, Marcel. The box remains the same. The city is not changing the box that has already been defined. And I guess millions of dollars been spent on research and study through rehousing, right? To actually find the solution, right? For what is the box based on narrow lots, regular lots, and large lots in Toronto, which range from 7.9 to 12.9 or something like that, right? That's lot sizes, meters, right? So this have already been studied and looked at. They are not changing the box. All they're doing here, as you can see, they're asking to increase the height to 10.5 and might say, whoa, that's a lot. Well, it's really just, it's already defined at 10. All they're asking for is just to define it so that we can add 5 more meters. By the way, not 5 meters, 0.5 meters.
0.5 meters. And really my understanding of that is to really make sure that basement height is increased so it kind of gets that natural light, right? So this kind of looks like a 3.5 story building. Correct?
Well, exactly. And that's exactly what it is, 3.5 story. So, so obviously you have thought this through as well. And that's the reality. Look, but just keep in mind, 0.5 meters is just under 2 feet, right? Like that's under 2 feet of height that's being requested. That's not going to cast any additional shadow on anyone's
that doesn't. I think where people are getting concerned is, especially in neighborhoods where houses are small, there's a lot of bungalows, maybe they're 1.5 stories or 2 stories at the most. These new homes look massive, right, in comparison. And I think there's going to be a bit of normalization that will happen as things get developed and these newer homes come online. But the old homes, the wartime bungalows are quite small in comparison, and I think that's where there's a bit of shell shock, right? So
Oh, absolutely. Well, I would say, man, I would definitely say like change is always difficult. Change is always difficult, but it's necessary, right? Nothing change, the only place that you don't get change is at the vending machine, right? That's what they say.
what else we got, Ron?
Hey, man, so that's really it. I will say this though, that for the most part, I would say I want to caution YIMBYs and NIMBYs in this sense, right? And say let's start with the YIMBYs, right? Just be careful that you think you can do sixplexes. Of course, let's say the bylaw does get approved by council and you are allowed to. Not every site has the ability to do it with no resistance. There's so many other factors that need to be considered: heritage, conservation, road widening, all these. There's a bunch of different factors that need to be considered. So not every site, I like to say, is sixplex sexy, right? So please look out.
Sixplex sexy.
No.
I like that. I like that.
Yeah,
Bit of a
yeah,
tongue twister.
Yeah, he has a little bit of a tongue twister, right? So not everything is sixplex sexy in the six, right? So be cautious about that. And to the NIMBYs, I'll say, look, there'll be a lot of people who are saying like, you know what, I'm sick and tired of this bylaw battle. I'm moving out of town, right? Well, okay, great. But they're going to probably want to move out with the biggest check possible, right? Again, it boils down to the same thing. We're still right now in a buyer's market. So make sure that you're getting the right advice. You will not be able to, like essentially move out with a small lottery in your pocket, right? Like these properties that still have market value to it, and you can't say you wanna list your property for $6 million because they can do sixplexes, right? Like it doesn't make any sense, right? So I just caution both the NIMBYs and the YIMBYs as they move into this new era of housing, like how this should be addressed, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of newbies I'm seeing in these groups and communities that I'm a part of. So hopefully, they're being cautious, working with the right professionals, and not getting ahead of their skis with their purchase, right? So with that said, this was a great unpack run. Lots of information that I think that we brought. We were you were there live in the house, front row, and this is something that we're going to continue to follow in the weeks ahead as it heads to council. Ron, take us home.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much, guys, for joining us here again today on Unpacked, where we take care of all your real estate news update. This is me, Ronald, your co-host, your 5-star Michelin multiplex designer, with my good friend Marcel, your mortgage and lending professional. We look forward to seeing you guys on our next video, but be sure to like and subscribe and leave us a comment, okay? We'll see you guys soon.
Thanks a lot. See ya.